like to offer you a very special one. If you've been in our community before, welcome back. We're here today because a lot of the communities that are represented here have a very significant common thread. And that common thread is disasters. But we are here because we don't want that to be the defining moment of our communities. We are here to work together, to share our learnings, to give back, and to help better prepare the next community that will face a disaster of proportions that these communities have endured. That's what I wish for my community, what I wish for yours. And it is now my pleasure to turn this program over to our co-chair today. She's a very special lady. She's a very special lady to the city of Joplin. I know she's very special to a number of the state and federal agencies that she's worked so very, very close with. She is a volunteer extraordinaire. I hope and I pray that your community has a Jane Cage. We are honored to welcome our Jane Cage to the podium.
Let's just wait and see how it turns out. Because it could be maybe not that good. But, you know, I have to tell you, it's really exciting to me to see all of you in the room. I manage registration, so I may not know you, but I can sure tell you that I know your name and where you're from, how you paid. I know everything. But with that, I do want to say that, you know, 5 years ago, I would never have expected that in Joplin we would be holding a conference like this. You know, it would never have occurred to me. 4 years ago, I would have said, we have come a long way in a year, but we have a long way to go. 3 years ago, I think I would have said, you know, why aren't we any further along than we are? You know, we should be faster, we should be better, we should be rebuilt. A year ago, we started to say, you know, I can't believe that in a year it will have been 5 years. And 6 months ago, as planning started to move into high gear for this conference, we said that if we got 150 people in the room, we would be really excited. And so last week I said, wow, because there are over 325 people registered for today, and I never imagined that could happen. So, in the words of the airlines, this is an extremely cold flight. When you go to a room, you need to move to the center because there'll be other people who'll be looking for a chair in some of these rooms. But I'll have to tell you, I'm a girl who can't say no, and I said yes to people who wanted to sign up even yesterday. Because I don't think this is going to be repeated in Joplin again next year. So I didn't want anybody to miss their chance. So, you know, today when I stand in front of you and I look back from 5 years until today, I'll have to tell you, first of all, that I'm humbled that all of you cared enough to come and learn about what's happened, not just in Joplin, but in cities across the central United States, that you believe there's a value in sharing. You know, it's not just Joplin's perspective that's at this meeting. There's Moore, Oklahoma, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and Minot, North Dakota, and Greensburg, Kansas, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and Kilder, Nebraska, and Bologna and Mayflower, Arkansas, and Stockton, all here to talk about what's happened in their communities. So by tomorrow afternoon, if I could project us just a day into the future, here's what I hope you'll be saying. That number one, you will have met someone like you from another community. And that you've made a relationship that can make a difference when something happens, because there's not a person who's sitting up front that won't tell you that relationships matter. Then I hope that you'll take home an idea that you can implement in your community from something that you've heard from one of us. And then lastly, I hope that what you'll learn is that there's no single prescription for disaster recovery. What suits one community doesn't necessarily suit another. Circumstances are different, demographics are different, geography is different, disasters are different. Any of you who've been around anyone from FEMA have heard the saying that every disaster is local. You know, I've rolled my eyes at that any number of times. But it is true in some ways that solutions are local, and at the end of the day, it's a community that helps itself to recover. It's not coming from the outside, it's coming from the people who live there and work there and govern there. So think about that as you listen this afternoon to the speakers that we have. A few logistics things for all of you. All the breakout sessions are on this floor, so you can stay right up here and move yourself from place to place. After we finish the FEMA webinar, at 3:15 there's a 15-minute break, and then there's a breakout session. Then tonight I had to decide where to take you for an opening reception. I don't think I could take you anywhere that we'd be more proud of than our new Mercy Hospital. No, not everyone has the opportunity to get a new hospital, but we have a really beautiful state-of-the-art facility that's a direct blessing that came from the tornado that we would never have had any other way. So I hope you'll go out there and visit and get a chance to see what that building is like. There'll be people there who can take you on a tour, who can explain the incredible construction that's made that hospital much more disaster resistant. After the reception is over, there's a lot going on in Joplin this weekend. I could send you to the baseball game tonight after the reception. I could send you downtown to Third Thursday, which is a popular event and a kind of a street fair. But there are a lot of places that you can go, but I'll tell you what I tell everybody when I leave the meeting, and that is, I don't care what you do tonight, just show up on time tomorrow. So have a good time, but be on time tomorrow, because we have a lot going on that you won't want to miss. I think it's going to be really terrific. For those of you who are social media, which would be unlike the mayor of Greensburg, that when we said use the hashtag Joplin Summit, he said, I only use hash browns. There's your great line stolen already.
Trying to help you out.
So I would say if you're going to tweet about it, take a picture, do anything, that will kind of build a buzz around this. So now I'm going to turn it over for what I think is a really great start. You know, I'm fortunate enough to know almost everyone on the panel at some level or another. Pre the Joplin tornado, I had been on a lot of church mission trips, and I had been to Greensburg, and I had been to Cedar Rapids. Post-tornado, I went to war because, you know, you were after us, so I couldn't get there beforehand, at least not the first time. But I've had a chance to meet them all, but this is the first time they've met each other, and, you know, and had a chance to talk to each other for any length of time. And so what I brought you is, I think, a panel of real experts when it comes to the long road to resilience. One of them has been on it. Our moderator this afternoon is Beth Freeman, a great friend to Joplin. She's the administrator of FEMA Region 7 based out of Kansas City, and what she and her team did for Joplin post-tornado was nothing worth, it wasn't anything less than spectacular. Now, this afternoon, it's not just us that are listening to this presentation. People all across the country are listening in on a nationwide webinar. So that doesn't mean that we can't sneeze or anything, but realize that there'll be people that are asking questions that will come to Beth from across the country, who are on the phone, who are watching on Adobe Connect, and then also you'll have a chance to ask questions here in person. So I'll change this over and we'll get set up and ready to go. So Beth, it's all yours.
While I'm kind of doing a little housekeeping for all of you, why don't the panel members come up and have a seat at your table? So as Jane mentioned, we'll be asking questions from around the country. We will be doing webinar tweets on the phone. For those of you in the room, if you would ask, we do need to use a microphone so the people on the webinar can hear. There's a microphone in the aisle here in the center, and we will have a laundry microphone down this side of the room, so that side doesn't have to try to get And for those of you on the webinar, the scratching noises are the panel sitting down. So I'm going to introduce all of our panel members, and then they're going to speak questions ready. So Bob Dixon is the mayor of Greensburg, Kansas. He's at the far end of the table. And Mayor Dixon was just re-elected mayor this last month. He's a native Kansan and has been a resident of Greensburg since 1985. And he's leading the way in the process of rebuilding Greensburg following the May 4, 2007 F5 tornado that destroyed 93% of Greensburg. And then next is Steve Eady. He's the city manager of Moore, Oklahoma. And he's been with the city of Moore since 1989, and he's been the city's lead administrator through the recovery efforts of the May 3rd, 1999 EF5 tornado, the May 8th, 2003 EF4 tornado, and most recently the May 20th, 2013 EF5 tornado, which devastated large parts of Moore. I think that we should just skip May in the calendar in Moore, Oklahoma.
I'm for that.
Okay. And then next to him is Mayor Walt Maddox, and he was sworn in as the mayor of Tuscaloosa November 13th for his third term as mayor, and in 2012, Mayor Maddox was named the Municipal Leader of the Year by America's City and County magazine for his strong, decisive, and comforting leadership after their big event in 2011. And next is Miranda Schuler. She is the city councilwoman in Minot, North Dakota. And Councilwoman Schuler is a North Dakota native and has served her community as an elected alderman since June 2014. And her desire to be a service to others is a product of the selfless service that she and her family received during and after the 2011 flood event in Minot. And then next is Sandy. And Sandy Fowler, who, you know, let there be truth in marketing. I lived 18 years in Cedar Rapids, so Sandy and I have known each other for 18 years, or a little longer. Sandy serves as the assistant city manager for Cedar Rapids, and she's held several positions in her more than 25 years in Cedar Rapids city government. And in 2008, just weeks before the city, Cedar Rapids suffered a devastating flood causing $6 billion in damage, Sandy became the assistant to the city manager. And lucky Sandy, timing is everything, right? Yes. And then in 2012, she was promoted, and she is currently the assistant city manager. And then next is Sam, sorry, Sam. Anson? Okay. The city manager here in Joplin, and Sam was the assistant city manager during the May 2011 tornado, and so he and I've known each other for 5 years at this point in time as well. And he's also worked in the communities of Ferguson and St. Peters, Missouri, where he's gained experience in volunteer management, municipal purchasing, and human resources. And finally, last but not least, is Troy Bolander, and Troy's the Director of Planning, Development, and Neighborhood Services for the City of Joplin. Troy has over 20 years of experience in project development and administration for the City of Joplin. So thank you very much. And Mayor Dixon, would you like to kick us off with your comments?
Well, all of you pretty well know the stories of each one of the communities represented here, and it's in the back of your program, so we're not going to retell.
Let's move the microphone down.
So anyway, you all know the stories of each one of the communities, so we're not going to go through and tell you about the disasters. We're going to share some other things post-disaster. One thing I think is super important post-disaster is you can be humbly grateful that you have an opportunity to rebuild a community or part of a community, or you can be grumbly hateful that it happened. Also, I would caution that you don't make life decisions rapidly. You're in a grieving process, you've had tremendous loss, you've had friends and family that have lost their lives, loved ones you know. Don't make those life decisions rapidly. Never give up, and never lose hope. That's what we're all in the room for, and that's what we all do to each other, why we get together, is to offer hope and encouragement. Too many times you're going to have people in the communities and in emergency management and everything that's represented here that you can get caught up in the suboptimal thinking. You've got to stay positive. Not everything's going to work out, and you have to be humble enough to say, this isn't quite working. We need to step back and rethink the process, whatever it is in your community. As Jane said, every disaster is local. What happens in Moore or Tuscaloosa or North Dakota in a flood or a tornado or an earthquake, whatever, is different. We're just called to share with each other hope and encouragement, what has worked, what has been extreme challenges. We're also called to be humble servants with a vision and a commitment to a brighter tomorrow and make our communities a better place to live and work for all of us. Each one of these communities represented, that's their goal, because that's true sustainability for your community. You can build back and throw things back together as quick as possible, but if you don't have that long-term vision with defined outcomes, you're not going to be a sustainable community as our ancestors built communities for us. The great Iroquois nation, one of their defining laws says, in every deliberation we must consider the seventh generation, 7 generations ahead. So it's not about us, it's about future generations.
Thank you. As they said, I'm Steve Eady, City Manager of Moore, Oklahoma. We've had the unfortunate pleasure, I guess, if you will, to have 3 major storms during the last 16, 17 years. And I've been the city manager or assistant city manager during all of those. So May is not my favorite month of the year by any means. Believe it or not, though, our community is better for having gone through these things. I can trace it back all the way back to the May 3rd of 1999 storm, and the citizens being completely shocked. We had no idea what we were going to do, how we were going to recover, if we were to recover. But the citizens of our community were looking to the city leadership, the mayor, the city manager at the time, myself, to lead the community, to put the community back together. And now we've unfortunately had to do that 3 times. We've had the same mayor, all 3 of those storms, the same administrative leadership. That's helped us significantly. We learned a lot about what to do and what not to do in the first storm that we experienced back in '99. Use those things to learn from, to go forward. Our community is much more resilient. Our citizens are much, much more weather aware than they ever have been. Probably, I know residents of all these communities are weather aware, but I think we're one of the most weather aware communities around. We have about 60,000 population. We have about 7,500 storm shelters, individual storm shelters and households out of about 20,000 households. So I would have to say we're probably one of the most well protected in terms of storm shelter communities around. So those kinds of things are important. It's important to lead your community, to be the face of the community. I'm real proud of what we've done in Moore over the years, not just with a single event, but with these 3 major events over the years.
Good afternoon. My name's Walt Maddox. I'm the mayor of City of Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Roll Tide. That's how most.
Say boomer soon.
Yeah. I wouldn't be doing my duty as a Tuscaloosan if I didn't say that. In Tuscaloosa, the mayor is also the chief executive officer of the city, so serves a city manager role like most major cities in Alabama. You know, Mark Twain said the 2 most important days in your life are the day that you were born and the day that you found out why. And I believe professionally, at least for me and my 1,400 colleagues at the city and the 98,000 people of Tuscaloosa, that why was April 27, 2011. It's the line of demarcation in our community. It's that BC AD moment by which all is judged by. for better or for worse. And the title of this seminar being The Road to Resilience, I certainly have a lot of thoughts on this subject and look forward to the dialogue with you. But let me just begin with a few initial notes. Back home, we'd say this is like putting 10 pounds of potatoes in a 5-pound bag. It's very difficult. But here's some initial thoughts I will share with you and look forward to going deeper. First, an adequate, or in fact, a more than adequate response begins with a more than adequate recovery begins with a superb response. Everything that you hope to rebuild your city to has to begin in the initial response so that your citizens feel confident in the leadership of local, state, and federal government. It requires communication both simultaneously to internal and external stakeholders. It requires going after low-hanging fruit on the short term, celebrating the victories, whether it's getting a road open, getting schools open, having that first week celebration. Never overlook those small psychological opportunities to boost the morale of your community. It makes sure that your city, and I approach this as a mayor, that your city has the infrastructure to handle this. And I'm not talking about roads and bridges and backhoes and things like that. Can your city financially take on a disaster, knowing that your federal and state partners are going to be days behind in arriving and at times years behind in making certain they meet their financial commitments? Those are just the beginning elements to the road to resiliency. And I want to thank Jane for putting this on today, because when you have your event, everyone rushes to your community. You may even get a visit by the president and high-ranking members of the cabinet. And the national spotlight burns very deeply on your community until the next major news story. And then you're left to rebuild your community. It's a lonely challenge. And discussions like this will prepare municipal leaders going forward to meet that challenge. So Jane, I appreciate your vision, and I appreciate serving on this distinguished panel today.
Good afternoon. I'm Miranda from Minot, as previously was introduced. Basically, my take from this is I don't think that I've ever seen the best in people as much as I saw them in the days prior to our disaster, and especially the days after. People from our community absorbed the 12,000 of us that were displaced to the point where we had, I think, 120 in a shelter, and it was quickly shut down. People opened their homes to strangers. They took their things. They took their families, and that's what we did. So you guys have your states. We say North Dakota nice, and I think really North Dakota nice is the entire country, because the entire country came to help us when we needed help, and it was really an eye-opening experience for me and my family as we were trying to rebuild and trying to just get through and find out where we were going to go and what we were going to do. So a lot of the things that are being said, I could say the same things over again. It's important that your community understand that you have a plan, although finding a plan when you're not prepared for disaster is really a difficult thing. You almost have to look at things that you can never anticipate happening. Those comments, oh, that'll never happen here. Now when I hear that, I say, you don't want to say that, because someday it could, and you really want to be prepared for that to happen. As far off as a long shot it might seem that these things may happen to your community, they certainly can. So being prepared, even just a small amount for any kind of a disaster, whether it be a flood or tornado or fires, earthquakes, things like that, having some type of a roadmap for the citizens who are going to try to be recovering as well is really, really an important factor. And I've read it several times as well. Recovery starts out as a sprint and ends up as a marathon. I'm currently running that marathon personally and civically. That's probably the best thing that I've read so far. It really rings true to recovery in a sense that you try so hard to just get things moving, and it's always changing, ever changing, and you just got to be open to all kinds of different possibilities. So.
You said before the disaster, and in a tornado you don't know that. In a flood you see it coming. And so, there's certainly an element to that I think is interesting. In 2008, the city of Cedar Rapids had declared 2008 the year of the river. Sometimes karma, it just comes after you. So when our city, who, that has a river right through it, when the river surpassed any possible previous records, it still was very much a surprise. We did not have repeated flooding prior to the big flood of 2008. So it was a surprise for us. And some of the things that we thought of right afterwards, and then we're in our 8th year anniversary in June, and so a little farther away than some here, is to reflect back on communication. I know you can always say communication is such a key thing, but how are you talking to your residents? And again, in a flood, we had 5 days after the water crested before the neighborhoods were open for people to come back into. It took that long for the river to recede. So you're talking to residents who can't visit their home, can't see what's there and what's left. And so in those early days, but in the months and even years afterwards, communication was so important that we tried to get better and better at it. One of the things that I was particularly proud of is we trained some 80 of our 1,400 employees to become trained facilitators, so that when we started planning efforts very quickly after our flood, both on a flood control system, but also on a neighborhood planning process, so that people could reestablish neighborhoods in their heads so that they knew where to reinvest, whether to come back to those flooded areas. As you can imagine, in a flood like ours, many of the areas that were flooded were not in the 100-year floodplain, certainly outside of the 500-year floodplain. So we really certainly wanted people to come back to those areas, and they needed to know whether they could or not. So we started that planning process very quickly that addressed some of the things you've already heard today, which is planning. What can I do, and how do I get that information? And it feels very soon to start talking to people about that in the weeks and months after a disaster. And so one of the things that we did to facilitate that was every time we sat down, we didn't do big group sessions. You've never seen us do a group like this. We broke into small groups where people would sit at tables of 10 with trained facilitators. And the first thing they did was go around the table and you told your story. Before they could talk about what the future looked like, they had to tell you what happened to them. What have they lost? How did it go that day? What have they been experiencing since then? And that grieving process is very real. The other thing I would mention really here at the initial start is about businesses, the business recovery. Our entire downtown was flooded, as well as many of the surrounding neighborhoods. When you have your downtown flooded, there is really, in Iowa, we're the second largest city in Iowa behind Des Moines, and I think there's talk in Des Moines that Cedar Rapids wasn't coming back. We're a huge economic engine. We have a lot of manufacturing, and that downtown being flooded really put into question whether Cedar Rapids would stay intact or not. And one of the first signs of that was going to be the case. We are the largest cereal capital of the world. We make lots of cereal in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, with our agricultural base. So we have General Mills, but Quaker Oats is downtown, and they make all kinds of oatmeal and grits and life cereal, all kinds of stuff there. And it was underwater. Their entire plant was flooded. And it was days after the flood that one of the heads of PepsiCo that owns Quaker Oats flew into Cedar Rapids, and they hooked up a generator in downtown to light the Quaker Oats sign on the top of the building. And that CEO of PepsiCo out of Chicago came in to let our community know that Quaker Oats was coming back, and their 1,000 employees would still have a job. And that was a huge sign for Cedar Rapids that your job's going to be there, and those business leaders came together. And equally exciting were small business owners. And if you know small business owners, they're kind of independent. That's why they're small business owners, right? Well, you know what? In Cedar Rapids, they came together. Hundreds of them came together to talk about how does SBA work? How does FEMA work for them? What's their businesses like? How do they come back? Are their employees still there? Are their customers still there? And they came back in a way that I think was unforeseen, unseen in the past. And it's really exciting because that gives hope for all the neighborhood residents as well, that know if their businesses are there, then there's a reason to stay, and that's how you keep your community intact to get through the response time and then recovery. Glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Sam, City Manager for the City of Joplin, and I would like to echo the Mayor's comments and welcome you all to Joplin. If you haven't been here before, thanks for coming. If you have been before, thanks for coming back. I feel like the experts are at the table and spread throughout the room. We have several department heads in Joplin who've led the recovery in their respective areas. One of the top-notch people is sitting right here to the left of me, and our planning director. But hearing the panelists so far talk about some of their key takeaways, I would also echo some of Mayor Maddox's comments in terms of the people. News media is going to come and go. Federal agencies are going to come and go. Every community story is going to start and it's going to end with the people of that community. So our emergency management director, Keith Stammer, I think is in the room somewhere. He says it, I think, better than anybody else. It's the relationships that are most important, and those are going to be the things that carry you through a disaster in your community. So knowing who the people are, who the players are, what organizations are responsible for what is going to be key as you move forward, because when a disaster hits, you don't have a lot of time to open up a playbook and study and learn what you should be doing. You're going to be making a lot of decisions on the fly for your communities, and knowing the people in your communities and what their capabilities are is going to be key in terms of shortening that marathon time. I think we're in the midst of the marathon, as Miranda was mentioning earlier. We sprinted out of the gates with our recovery, with our search and rescue, and I would give credit to our police and fire departments, and also to the other 430 plus agencies from around the country who came to Joplin to help in our situation. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the local people who are going to be here to help carry on and sustain that recovery. So if you don't know who the key players are, if you have an event in your community, who operates the largest building in town so that you can go and potentially house people for a short term, who can bring those resources in. Obviously, Red Cross is a key player in that area, and Debbie Meads was instrumental in setting up our shelter. So is Missouri Southern. This campus turned into a beehive of activity after they graduated their class that May. They had probably as many, if not more, people on campus throughout the entire summer. And so those partners in your communities are going to be key to identifying who they are and what roles and services they can provide, because that's going to help you get back to normal, whatever the normal definition of normal is going to be in your community. They're going to be the ones who can help you get back to that as quickly as possible. So I'll end my comments there. Certainly, we're here for you, so we want to make sure that we give you guys the time that you need to answer the questions that you have. But I'll turn it over to our planning directors.
Right, thank you, Sam. Well, the disadvantage of being last is all your comments have been made. But, but no, I think one of the takeaways that I got out of this, learn to lead. You have to lead, especially from the local level. I think when you go to a disaster such as we went through, people are looking for a familiar face, looking for that comfort, and that sets the stage. That gives them confidence things are going to be all right. So it's not up to your federal partners, not up to your state partners, it's the community. So you have to learn to lead and make decisions. So often, especially in the political realm, sometimes people are afraid to make a decision, afraid of the consequences or what people are going to think. But you can't do that in a disaster. You have to make a decision, because if you're indecisive, you don't project that confidence. That's one of the bigger things that we experienced. From a planning background, that's my background. Make sure you have plans in place. We didn't. What do you do when 30% of your housing is impacted or destroyed by an event? What are you going to do? Jobs, businesses destroyed. So have a plan in place. And that was probably one of our efforts. You always think it's not going to happen to you, but it can. And I guarantee it will happen to someone or some community that you're representing in this audience. So be prepared. The other thing that I observed, and I don't share this too much, but it does have to do with leadership. Our council, our city manager, gave us a lot of latitude in making decisions, because you have to make decisions in a hurry, And sometimes you can't go through that normal process. It just takes too long. But over time, you have to get that influence and power up. I recognize it with myself. You get in a position when people around you are patting you on the back and saying you're doing a great job. It's how the community feels. So you slowly have to give that power back to the council and the citizens. In the beginning, you're acting like a benevolent dictator. You really are. And that's the only way it can be done, because you have to make decisions quickly. But you have to give that influence and power up. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll make this the 30-second warning, so start thinking about what questions that you want to ask. And people on this side of the room, if you'd move to the microphone to ask your question, and people on this side of the room, if you just go to the center aisle, we'll have a microphone there for you. And while you're doing that, I'll ask a question to kind of get things kicked off. And since you were last, I'll let you be first this time. So if there was one piece of advice you would give someone in a similar position, what would that be?
Probably the greatest challenge we had is being prepared, as I emphasized. About 30% of our housing was destroyed or impacted by the disaster. We did not have good data of what was lost. We had to actually set a road and look at old maps to try to figure what was lost. There were some homes converted to apartments, many homes destroyed. We just didn't have good data to track. So you can imagine trying to address the housing needs. We didn't know exactly what you want. So I emphasize having a good plan in place for events such as this. And it's always going to change. Each event's unique. Update that plan. Don't do it at the very last. Another thing I heard it addressed or stated at this table is relationships. If it wasn't for the relationships we have already developed, it would have been as successful. Our housing partners, such as Habitat, we worked with them in the past. Some of our nonprofits, and we already had a relationship developed. And it's too late to form those after disaster. It really is. So those are the two takeaways I think.
Great. Sam?
For me, I guess my words of wisdom would be number one, take care of your people, because we had, I don't think I went to sleep until Wednesday after the tornado, lived on Mountain Dew and bottle caps for 3 days essentially. So, but make sure that the people who are working for you take the breaks that they need to take. Go home, get some sleep. The work is still going to be there today. I think one of the comments that we heard on the conference call when we were all sitting down was also keep in mind that the sun's going to come up tomorrow. There's going to be more work that's going to need to be done, but don't do it all today because you're going to burn yourself out really quickly. So prepare yourself to be able to make those decisions in a timely manner that need to be made if it's involving threats to life and safety. But when it comes to planning and cleaning up the roads, you have a little bit more time on your hands to be able to deal with some of that. So don't push your people too hard. And then I would also, introspectively, I would say take care of yourself too. We had city manager of Springfield, Missouri, the third largest city in the state of Missouri, come down. I don't even know when it was. It was probably in that first 3 days when I was in that mental fog. But he came down wanting to help, and we ended up having him sort business cards, because we received so many calls and so many visits from people who wanted to help and vendors who wanted to profit off of the disaster. So rely on the experts that are going to be able to come and help you. One of the things that we talk about in our state city managers association is a lot of communities have mutual aid agreements. They're really popular among police and fire departments. Public works agencies are starting to get on board with those as well. But there's not really a mutual aid agreement for administrative support. So building inspectors, and city managers, and IT people, and HR people. It would be beneficial to have somebody in the room who can spell you, basically take some of the load off of your shoulders so that you're not having to be the one person to make all of those decisions. Ultimately, you're going to be responsible and held accountable for the decisions that you make if you are a city manager, but surround yourself with good people who are the experts in those areas so that you can make the decision with much information as you had available at that time, but then make the decision to move on. If you make the wrong call, admit to it. We had several lessons that we could learn, that we could teach, pass on to other communities. A disaster of our scale, don't block off the area and prevent residents from going home to get their stuff. We tried that. 3 hours later, we had to do away with it because it just didn't work. We had so many people that wanted to get in there and take care of their things. Curfew was a good idea. Put the curfew in place so that after it gets dark, don't allow people in those areas because that'll minimize the looting and some of the things. But understand that at the end of the day, it's about taking care of the people that you have who work for you and the people in the community who are doing a lot of that work as well.
Sandy?
Great, thank you. We learned that lesson too about keeping people out of the area. It backfired poorly. We too opened it up really quickly in a good way, but you have to figure that out. One of the things I would say, we benefited from having a nuclear power plant in our area. We are within a 10-mile radius of a nuclear power plant. So our emergency management was just number one, and had relationships between all of our emergency responders in the region at the time of the flood, and for how many years before that, decades before that. I think that led to the success of us having no lives lost in our disaster, which we, I think, didn't realize how profound that was. But I credit our emergency responders having very, very strong relationships with one another because of this other phenomenon in our community.
And Sandy, since I know the answer, how many people did you evacuate in Cedar Rapids?
28,000.
So something like 20% of the population of the city was evacuated.
Right, we did 234, I think, river rescues, boat rescues. We had a lot of people stay in their homes while the water rose because they just simply couldn't believe it was happening, I really think. The second reason, because we didn't have a place for them to take their pets. Something we learned in our disaster, you have to have a shelter for animals because people will not leave their homes without them, nor probably should they, because then we had to go back and rescue pets when the ones that left them. That became we housed over 1,000, maybe I think even up to 2,000 animals in our equestrian center at our local community college for months afterwards. A very successful way to get people out of their homes safely and take care of their pets while they were in either shelters for a little while and then in housing, doubled up and things like that where pets still weren't okay. And so it really was a huge lesson learned for us as well. The one pitch I would give is about mental health, that start paying attention to the mental health of your residents and your coworkers and volunteers and faith-based leaders right away from the very beginning. Make sure somebody in the room is thinking about that when they wake up in the morning, because taking care of people for that long haul in the days afterwards, but the weeks and months probably gets harder and harder, honestly. And we had some terrific mental health support in our community for years afterwards. At our city council meetings for a couple of years, we had mental health experts in the lobby who amazingly knew how to approach people and have conversations with them about the hurt they still felt about what had happened. And I think that really made a difference for our residents.
Miranda.
Thank you. I would say an open line of communication that is saying the same thing. We had a news station that took it upon themselves to go 24 hours on air, all things flood, for the 3 weeks that we were inundated. Prior to that, we had been evacuated one time, got to go home for 2 weeks, and then we were evacuated for the big waters, and we're basically kept out of our homes for 3 weeks. We didn't have people that didn't leave, which was different for us. Everybody did leave. We did have a pet shelter, but we had, like I said, a good open communication with one specific television network. So those of us that didn't have a home and were living in people's campers or driveways or whatever, we all knew we could turn on the television and we could tune into one specific station and get information that was either new or was information that we would need to get. There was also press conferences held quite often that would give us additional information during those times when we were kind of in limbo. After we were able to go back to our homes, most of us didn't have electricity or anything like that, so watching TV wasn't a luxury, or wasn't something that we could do. It wasn't a luxury we had at that time. We relied on the Salvation Army to come around, and they helped to feed us. They also were able to distribute information to us. One thing that looking back on it, I wish there would have been a frequently asked questions flyer sent out. People say, well, we had one online. But again, if you're homeless, you don't have the ability to get online as easy as someone who can go home. So the services that we had from the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, if they were able to hand out a frequently asked questions or information on phone numbers to contact or places to go, that would be tremendously helpful for those people who are just trying to navigate, a maze, basically, like I'd stated before, that seems to be ever changing. So, and then also, to piggyback, on your mental health, I wasn't in the position I'm in now, but I know several of the people who worked for the city of Minot at the time, and my frequently asked questions brochure or pamphlet would also play into this. People were contacting the city offices, contacting whoever they could get to answer the phone, because the phones rang nonstop. The challenge for us is many of those people that were working in those positions at the time also lost their homes. So they're grieving, they're confused, they're not sure what's going to happen with their families or their homes and different things like that, but they're answering calls from people who are emotionally charged. They're confused. So what I would say is make sure that those people that are answering the phones, because they will take a lot of phone calls, have a resource where they can step away from those calls for a while, regroup, some type of counseling service, because they're going to probably need it. Those of us that called in, we were crying, we were hurt, we were sad. These are all emotions that you're throwing at someone who generally takes a phone call, maybe having a question about a pothole or how do I do a permit for something. They're not prepared for those kinds of calls. So having something for those people as well that are taking those calls would be eminently important.
Well,
I've always looked at this as a three-stage process, first being the forward-leaning before something happens, the response, and the recovery. So briefly, first, in terms of being forward-leaning, the best thing, in my opinion, that FEMA does is this integrated emergency management course in Emmitsburg, Maryland. Myself and 60 of our staff members went through that training in January of 2009, and it was from that training that so many of our disaster protocols were built and refined over time that led us to April 27, 2011. And I approached this as a mayor or city manager. Just one of these problems would be enough to suffocate you. We had 20 operational teams within the first 12 hours dealing with life and death situations. So you don't get the luxury of getting one problem at a time. You get 20 major problems simultaneously with scarce resources. That's why that training is probably some of the best and actually should be required of every local elected official and should be expanded by the federal government without haste. So in terms of the response, the two biggest mistakes we made in terms of the response, and there were more than just two, by the way, but the two that are glaring are pretty simple now that you look back. First, we assumed that we would have every asset to deploy to 5,300 structures being on the ground. We didn't, because what happened along the way is we lost 6 city facilities. Those city facilities had EMA, the agency you need during a disaster. We lost a police precinct that had 17% of our police assets. Both of our primary communication towers were destroyed. So we lost 911 and interoperability among ourselves and other agencies. In fact, texting and Southern Link was the only way we could communicate in the first few hours after the tornado. We lost a major fire station in the eastern portion of our city. We lost 85% of our heavy equipment, which you need to move debris out of the way. So we had never really assumed that function in our disaster management plan. And it took us a while to overcome those hurdles. Unfortunately, the mutual aid agreements helped, but in that day in Alabama, 42 other counties had enough damage to be declared presidential disaster areas. So our state government was stretched extremely thin. And of course, it takes FEMA about 72 to 96 hours to be fully mobilized, as well as the National Guard. The other thing that happened to us that really set us back, and it took us about 24 to 48 hours to understand it, is both the Salvation Army and the Red Cross were also destroyed. So the humanitarian delivery within our disaster management plan was knocked out. But we didn't quite understand it. Our IC did a good job of processing everything, but none of us knew the impact until we got 24 hours in, when you began to look up from search and rescue and then begin seeing this humanitarian crisis build. None of us, at least at the city, we never worked through that pre-April 27th. In terms of the recovery, again, there's so much I would love to share with you, but time prohibits that. Probably the biggest mistake I made is that well-meaning federal officials and not so well-meaning consultants will come to your city. Neither one will be able to deliver what they promise. Keep that in mind.
I think probably the biggest takeaway for me is I think local officials, city officials need to have a good understanding of how FEMA works, frankly. I go back to 1999, and I'll never forget all those consultants, all those people coming to town, and we had really no understanding of what they were there for at the time. I'll never forget sitting in a meeting in my office, and the various representatives all using acronyms from the federal government that you have no idea what they stand for.
We don't know either.
All of these people were in the room, and they were there to help us. And I'll never forget, there was one gentleman that introduced himself and said he was from the Coast Guard. And I didn't quite understand in the middle of Oklahoma why the Coast Guard was there, and I don't know that I know that yet today, but the point is, I think if city officials need to be aware of how FEMA works, FEMA is your best friend in a disaster like this. You can't make it through a disaster like this without FEMA. Having an understanding of how it works, if you can bid out your debris removal processes before you ever have a tornado or an event like this, you're in much better shape. Get things done beforehand. Debris management plans, those sorts of things. And then having the relationships, and we've talked about this already, having relationships with your local providers, Red Cross, others, the faith-based community, and how they can help. Know as much as you can about what's going to happen, the processes that are going to happen, the rules and regulations that FEMA brings with it. They bring the money, and you have to have the money, but they do make the rules and regulations. And those are often fairly burdensome. And it's been our experience that they kind of change along the way, depending on what happens and who's making those decisions. But I think that's the one takeaway I have is do the best you can to understand what's going to happen and how the processes work when there's a presidentially declared disaster. President Obama visited our community about a week afterwards. That was a defining moment for us. It really helped. It helped our community. But the events and the things that you have to go through just for that to occur are pretty amazing. And so, again, as much as you can understand about those things, I think would help.
Bob?
Again, the beauty of being last is it's all been said. But I just thought as everyone was visiting, and I visited with a gentleman from Greensburg just before the meeting, Matt Dighton. He helped coordinate our volunteers out there. But he mentioned about still the amount of debris that's still going 9 years later to our landfill. People don't fear change. People fear loss. And in my garage, I still have tornado debris in plastic tubs because my children and my wife think we need to save those because we're going to go through that one of these days. 9 years later, it hadn't been gone through. We have trouble turning loose of things in life. So now we're still taking some stuff to the landfill. Be cognizant and aware of the mental health of our communities and what that means to us. Also in the process, find common ground. My idea isn't the best. When I overemphasize my self-importance, I'm in big trouble. Great things happen when there's total disregard for who gets credit. You got to find a way to reason together to maximize the resources available and understand that you are not entitled to anything. The federal government and the state government, as Mayor Maddox says, is not there to really help you. They're not there to make you whole. They're there to walk side by side, hand in hand. You have to have a vested interest in it. If you feel you're entitled, that everything's going to be okay and it's made whole after a disaster, that's not true. It's the community that makes itself whole, not any government agency. So anyway, I commend the panel. They really gave you some great answers on that question.
Okay, we're ready for our first question from the audience. And if you could state your name too, please.
Jim Garrett from Kentucky Emergency Management. So we've heard this afternoon, some of your comments about planning and thinking ahead. Of course, a disaster like you've all faced and survived through gives us the opportunity to do it all over again, and get it right when we rebuild our communities. We heard, Mayor, that you said, don't make life decisions rapidly. Yet, I'm going to turn to Jane in her introduction, that she said, well, it was 3 years after the tornado, and I could have asked, why isn't it all fixed yet? So as, officials, what would you say, how do we live between that don't make life decisions rapidly and yet a population that wants it fixed as quickly as possible?
Okay, who would like to address that?
Well, since I said that, don't make life decisions rapidly.
You were last time, now you're first. So.
People don't fear change, they fear loss. Okay? So, people want some sense of normalcy, and that is the function of government. Whatever we can do to get some sense of normalcy, whether it is the light on the Quaker Oats sign, whether it is the fire station that's built back immediately in that neighborhood, the commitment that the city is committed to rebuild, whether it's the water tower that goes up that's a beacon of hope. Citizens know that they're going to have the utilities and the infrastructure if they decide to rebuild. Now, you can go home and you can cry because you still haven't dealt with your emotional lose and everything, but you never let the public see that. It's always positive. It's always, we are going to make this together, and we're rowing down the same river together.
Anyone else?
A couple of quick thoughts, because again, like response, all recoveries are local. And the way we approached the response in Tuscaloosa, if the tornado would have been a mile north or a mile south, it would have been a totally different approach. But in our particular case, the 12.5% of the city that was destroyed, the median income was $25,000 and less. In fact, 32% of the homes destroyed had a median income of less than $15,000. We had nearly $700 million worth of infrastructure needs. We had a higher unemployment rate. We had large floodways that bisected the tornado zone. So for us, it required a more robust, a more active, a more citizen-engaged recovery plan. But again, if that tornado that came through Tuscaloosa was a mile north or a mile south, it might have been a totally different approach. So it has to be community-led, and it also has to be something that I think Troy touched on. It has to be data-driven. Data is an absolute necessity as part of this process, because your community is going to ask, why are we doing this? And when I could go to the community and talk about those stats and say, on April 26, 2011, Rosedale, Forest Lake, Alberta, the areas of the city that were damaged and destroyed, they were not living up to their potential. This is our opportunity to do it the right way and to honor all those who lost so much.
Our situation, what I can recommend is definitely involve your community, your recovery efforts, and that's what came out of Jane Cage and her group. You have to know your community. We're very mostly conservative around here, and I'd like to say there's a healthy suspicion of government. So we know any kind of change or plans, accepting of the plans, it really had to be citizen-led. In fact, that was a debate we had amongst ourselves when we were first discussing the citizen committee. How much does the city get involved? And it's hard to give up that control and power and just let someone else drive the bus. But we knew for the citizens to be involved and accept that plan, they had to be a part of it. So that's what we had to do. I don't want to say it's going to work that way for every community. But in our situation, it was a citizen-led plan.